Hi, I'm Amy Peters, and I'm a product manager at SAS. Welcome to the session on modern data and analytics engineering in depth. What we'll talk about in this session is what we never talk about, which is all the hard work that needs to go in before the analytics can happen, finding your data and getting it ready. So we'll begin looking at what kind of data we've got available to us for this project. And I am in the Discover Information Assets area, which is SAS Information Catalog, where I can see I have agents active on many different data sources. So I've got some data out there in Google BigQuery and Parquet. It looks like I need to work on my Salesforce connection. No worries, because actually what I know I need is going to be on Snowflake. So these are assets that are being auto-discovered for me. And if I take a look at kind of the main screen, what I get is an overview of the system that I'm in. And so this particular system, it's small in terms of how many reports and models and so forth, but we've got a decent number of data sets out there that are being looked at. And I can use this to try to find information about energy consumption. And so there's lots of options here in terms of searching. So there's lots of availability in terms of creation, modification, whatever. Let's just find out, is there anything out there that has to do with energy? Because I know I've got some data out there. And it ends up that there is an energy consumption data set in Snowflake, which is of interest to me. So let me drill into that. And what I see at first is kind of some overview information, which is incredibly helpful. First of all, letting me know what kind of data privacy might be of concern. In this case, since country information is in there, this is a candidate for some privacy issues. And as well, it gives me information about the time period covered, most common values in this case. And I get a summary that's actually created from natural language processing just about the metadata of this data. So where it is, the data was collected in certain years, the fact that there's some outliers. So this is data that I'm interested in, and I can get an awful lot of information just by looking at what's available in Information Catalog. So if I drill into the column analysis, I can see, for example, that I've got a year field, and you can see over here to the side, I've got a summary, but just to drill a little bit, to be able to get some really basic information about distribution, some data quality information. And if I look at something more like character, say, for example, country, I get, again, even more information about distribution, kind of pattern frequency, all sorts of actually really helpful, just quick at a glance. And also you'll notice here, one of the criteria that I've got, I have an indicator that lets me know that there's outliers, which might be an issue. And if I drill into this particular one, I can see very quickly that, yeah, I've got some serious outliers going on here. And this is probably something that I'm going to want to handle when I start managing my data and doing some data prep. But while we're here, just to give you a little bit more information, for example, I can get data quality measures very quickly to see what my common denominators are, completeness, uniqueness. Again, just a lot of at a glance, really helpful information. And as well, since this is a data governance application, I have the processes that I can use to move data through, for example, a process of data being reviewed and then being flagged as maybe having an issue, and perhaps then went to the point where we'd like to have it approved for general use. So the user can quickly see what state this data is in. So again, tons of really helpful information. And now I realize, all right, I need to do some data preparation work to get this to the point where the data scientists can use it. So let me just take it and I'll just go straight into SAS Studio, which is going to allow me to do my my analysis. So before we dive into using the data, let me just mention that there are lots of ways of connecting into different kinds of data. And just to give you an example, here's a new library connection dialog where you can see just the wide range of data sources that are available to connect to. So in this case, fortunately, our administrator has done this for us. So we've already got our connection to our Snowflake data, and we can get going with getting our data prep going. So give you an idea of how you can work here. There's, again, a variety of places. It's a really nice IDE because if I'm a programmer, then I can just go straight into editing a SAS program or a Python program. However, for this example, I'd like to start out with a flow. And the nice thing about a flow is that it's a good starting point for somebody who either, number one, just wants to organize their work visually, or also for folks who are just not really into coding, want more of a kind of low or no code type of situation. So in this case, let's have our flow and let's add our energy consumption table that we found in Snowflake that we know that we'd like to have. All right. So the first thing I want to do is I know that the country code, the countries are kind of not in a form that I want to use. So what I'd like to do is do some data quality work to standardize countries. And so the first thing I'm going to do is pull up my query tool. And what I'd like to make use of a query here is I want to get basically just all the countries, just the values that I have, so the distinct values. So really what I want the output of this query to be is all the distinct values of country. So the reason I'm showing you this is because it's a lovely way for someone to learn SQL because we can look at the code that's generated. But also, again, just if I don't really want to use SQL and I really just want to have a point and click way of doing this. So what's going to come out of this query is a list of all the countries that I have. And so what I'm going to make use of is a step that's been shared with me to do some data quality standardization. So I'll connect this up, and this step allows me to indicate what I'm going to standardize. In this case, it's just that country column that I just created. I'm going to leave the variable name that gets created by its to default. I'm fine with that. Do this in English. And what I'd like to do is to get the 3-character ISO country codes. Cool. All right, so let's just give this much a try and see what we get. So if I take a look at the output port, so this is essentially what the data that will be coming out of this last node, what I can see is that I do have my country and my country code, and cool, this worked out well. I ended up with the country codes that I wanted. So now what I can do is take this and merge it back into the data that my main data that I have that's got all of the analytic table columns that I want to be able to use. So let's add another query and let's move it out here so that I end up with a join. So again, what's nice here is looking at this query, it's very easy for me to say, okay, I want all the data from my original data set that's got all of the numeric values that I want to analyze. Plus, for the new standardized country, I'd like to get those country codes in and add those. And I can also see really quickly that the join itself was generated for me based on what it thought was the best match, which is something I can easily change. So one other thing I'd like to do to this data before I finish up is I would like to do a bit of manipulation on one of my columns. So I'm going to make use of a calculate column step, which is available to me, which is an easy point and click way of creating new columns. In many cases, the easiest is based on existing columns. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to take this date field, which contains the year, and instead I would like to change it so that really all I have left in here is the year value itself. So it's a very easy, again, point and click way of creating some data and creating columns that I can preview the code if I'd like to see, what's going on, what's been generating for me. So there's a few other things that I'm going to do here, but let me just add one more thing to kind of give you an idea is I do have a little bit more data that I want to analyze. And in this case, the piece of data that I want to deal with is a CSV file. So let me drag that over to create the beginnings of a flow for that. And what I'd like to do is I would like to add an import to this. And what this import tool is really helpful to have is the ability to analyze what's going on in this file and to get some suggestions of what kind of columns it thinks are there, the data types, perhaps the names of the columns, and things like that. So in this case, the analysis is giving me the columns that I think I want, and doing a quick eyeball of the data. This looks good. So rather than me kind of building all of this for you, let me also give you one other kind of interesting thing here, which is to organize this. You notice I've got two different flows going on, and it may be that I want to run one before the other. So another thing that's really interesting that I can do is make use of the submission order pane. And what that means is I can turn this on, and what it does for me is it creates what you call swim lanes, or another organizational tool to say, here's the order of the the pieces of the flow that I want to run. So rather than you watching me build this whole thing, let me just open up a flow that I've already built. So I've been using it before, so let me just open it up from here. And what you'll see is this is the flow we were building together, just kind of already done all for us. So I've got my snowflake table where I'm doing some manipulation of getting the standardized country code and getting the year the way I want it. Do the same thing with that CSV file to be able to import it again, do some standardization and do some cleaning up of the data. And then finally, what I have is a node that I haven't shown you before, which is this one more step that actually takes the fact that this is finished and sends a message to Microsoft Teams. So let me just take a second to talk about this, because I kind of glossed over this earlier, in that when you look at the steps that are available in SAS Studio, the list you see here actually does change. Actually, we output new steps all the time. So these continue to get built. But what you might not realize is that you can build your own steps. So this post a message to Microsoft Teams step is actually an example of what we call a custom step, which is well, in this case, a coworker has created this input, or this set of prompts to allow me to indicate, okay, here's a team that I like to post to, and here's the message that I'm going to be using for that. So where this actually is if I were to look at the steps that I have available. And here, what I'm going to do is open this up in edit mode, since I have the authority to do that. And so now what we're looking at is the designer. And so what this is a canvas where you create the controls that you want. So in this case, this is really just a text box, which is taking in some information. And the information that's brought in here is then being fed into a program behind the scenes. And if you happen to care, this is a proc HTTP, which is going to do the sending of the message over to Microsoft Teams. So what this means is you can use all these different controls along here, drag them onto the canvas, and then configure them so that they feed information into your programs. So what this means is you've got an enormous amount of power to create more user interfaces on top of your code that you can then use. So for example, this get country code was another example of this, of a custom step that somebody can use. So it's an incredibly powerful feature that I think, it's already being used quite a bit, and I think it's going to be something that'll be very popular. So to finish this off, let's just make sure all this runs. So let's just take this entire flow and give it a whirl. So it finished successfully, and I can see that the message was posted in Teams that the data is now ready for us to use. Cool. All right. So now we've got our data all set up. So now we can go on to doing a little bit more manipulation to get it ready for analytics. So I have one more flow I want to bring up that I've already created that will allow me to do just a little bit more data prep before we're ready to get going with analyzing. So we've got the two data sets that we've created from the previous flow. We're going to pull them together and we're going to do a little bit more querying. So basically here we're doing another uh, distribution to try to figure out how many countries have a lot of years of history. And then we're making use of a pretty nice step, and let me just bring it over here to show you where it came from, is the branch rows step is what we're looking at. I went ahead and already filled it out so that you don't have to watch me do all that. But basically what you can see is it's a very easy kind of if-then type of builder to be able to split rows off between two data sets. And so essentially we want to be able to pull off the countries that have more than 100 years, in this case, under 14 years of history. So I can see the conditions that are saying what output rows are going to go to the different output ports, because ultimately I'm just going to leave the countries without a whole lot of data on their own, and the other countries is where I'm going to put in my final data mark. Another thing just to point out is if I didn't want maybe I'm going to give this flow to another user and maybe I don't want to have them go through and learn all that. There is a nice feature where I can add notes to the different, both in my notes, the notes can go in nodes themselves, or in this case, this is just a sticky note that I put on the flow to give whoever's using it after me a little bit more information, which is nice, a nice thing to have. So these are all things that kind of we're used to being able to use steps. In this case, I'm not using a custom step in this flow, but to use some existing steps and that incredibly helpful query builder to get the data manipulated the way I want. So there's one last thing on this particular flow that's new that is of interest, which is the ability to make use of a Python program. So what I'm showing you here is this last node, rather than being in the SAS language, is in Python. And so before I kind of drill into it, let's just go ahead and run the flow and see what kind of output we get. So we have a successful run, and I really haven't spent much time showing you some of the other tabs here. But before I do, let me point out that really at any particular node, I can right click and go specifically to, for example, the code that's been generated for that node, the log that's been generated for that node, run it specifically, run this node, run from this node. So there's lots of options. But let's go into our submission tab to see what basically has been created for us. And so what I see is at first some of the results are basically the graphical result that gets created. And this has actually been generated out of that Python program. And just to kind of complete our data story, you'll notice that here, this was the coal, what was it? The coal consumption, basically, the coal consumption change. And you'll see I've got a bit of a scaling problem. So this is what the data looked like before I applied a few functions in Python. And then if I look afterwards, the scaling looks a lot better. So I made use of just a few graphics that I can do in Python as well as doing the actual scaling. But also just note that I can use these other tabs to see, for example, the log that came back, as well as be able to see the generated code. So all very interesting, great tools to be able to use. Let's go back to just our visual flow and take a little bit of a closer look at the Python program that we were using. So if I look here, I can see in the flow itself that this particular Python program is referenced. It's actually a file that exists on my server. And actually, just so you can see what I'm talking about here, let's go back over to the Explorer. And what you'll be able to see is here's the path, and I can look through the server path and see here's where that particular file was saved. And so what I'm looking at here is what's in that file currently, and it's a program perhaps that I borrowed from a coworker who's maybe really good at Python. I don't want to have to rewrite it all, so I'm just kind of stealing or borrowing or whatever, collaborating. That's probably the better way of saying it. Collaborating. I can edit this straight from the node, but just to prove that I can, let's open this just straight in an editor. So this is, again, just a standard .py file. And what I can see is I've got some Python code here, and frankly, I'm not going to do a whole lot of running. So let's just change, just so that you prove that I can do this. I'm going to change my tab layout so that the log and code and results are kind of all stacked on each other, and it gives me a bit more real estate here. But what you'll notice is I have syntax highlighting. So this is a basic Python editor. And what I also want to kind of point out are the kinds of things that are available here. So, for example, I've got some code here that allows me to take data that's coming from a SAS data set and basically put it into a data frame. So the ability to transfer data pretty easily between SAS and Python. And what you'll notice is later on in this code, I go the other way, right? I take the data that we've created and basically put it back into a data set. So being able to go between SAS and Python from a data perspective is really quite easy. And if you're not that familiar with Python, you'll see here at the top that I am importing a bunch of different packages that I want to use, and basically the flow of this program is that I am using some of the graphics packages to give you the report that I showed you earlier, which kind of shows me the problems that I was having with scaling, and then I'm making use of some functions that are available in Python to actually do the scaling for me, and then again, as I mentioned, taking the data and putting it back out into a SAS data set so that I can then use it for the analysis that I want to do later. So one other thing that's interesting about this, other than just the fact that I am editing Python code, is this particular file is being stored in a local repo that is being managed by Get. So if you're not familiar with Get, it is and actually while I'm talking, let me just bring up the Get interface. It's a way for people to collaborate. Basically, it's a source management system. So to be able to say, I want to uh, have code that's out there that multiple people can use. So it's a shared file system where I can uh, pull code out, make changes to it, and then push the code back for others to use and for others to see what kind of changes I've made. So what we're looking at here is a kind of a zero state, if you will, of a Get interface, basically within SAS Studio. There's lots and lots of really good Get interfaces out there. So, but this is one if you want to kind of stay in the Studio environment. And so it's keeping up with the changes that are going on in that file system that I showed you before. So let's just say that I do have some change that I want to make to this particular Python program. And just to be safe, I'm just going to do something kind of silly and add a comment. And while I'm doing it, just to show you, there is some syntax suggestions, which are nice if you need that kind of help. All right, so just a very basic comment to say, okay, I've made a change to this program. So let's give it a save. And now let's go back to our Get interface. So what we can see is since Get is watching that particular folder, it recognizes that there's something out there that I've made a change to, and there's some basic diff functionality that's available, and it shows, okay, here's the change I made, which we know is just a kind of a basic one. And what I can do now is go through the normal process with Get, which is to be able to say, I'd like to I'd like to be able to take the unstaged changes and I'd like to move them into staging. And then from there, I can take the changes that have been staged and push them on up. So in this case, basically, I'm just saying document. Let's type it right. Document packages or something like that. And I can commit that change. And at this point, if I'd like to, I can go ahead and push the change back to the main repository. And if I want to make sure that I actually did do what I promised that I did, let's pop over to the main repository on GitHub, and I can see that there's the change that I just made. So pretty cool, actually. So what we've talked about are really a whole lot of collaboration possibilities. So we've seen how we can bring data in from lots of different data sources, be able to do some manipulation in a low or no code environment, be able to use multiple languages for a combination of, in this case, both SAS as well as Python, and then to be able to collaborate with others in a main sharing system like something like Get. So there's pretty powerful in terms of getting your data ready to do the hard stuff, really, which is really the analytics. Thanks so much for attending.